Okay, so if you've taken an algebra class, you have probably spent a disproportionate amount of time graphing lines. And you'll notice I've got a bunch of graph paper here. So I'm going to talk real briefly about how to graph a line by hand. And the main reason that we want to think about how to graph a line by hand is that that's going to help us think about what we're seeing when we look at a graph and what choices we should make when we go to draw a graph on a computer instead. So let's graph a line by hand, and we're going to pay careful attention to making a plan for what our graph is going to look like. So I'm not going to give you a scenario here. I'm just going to give you the equation of a line. And since it's abstract, my variables would normally be called x and y, but because we're almost never going to work with variables named x and y in real life, I'm going to give them different names, just so that we can see how to handle those when we draw a graph. So here's an equation. We're going to graph the equation h equals -2/3 t plus 7. And just as a note, we're going to note that we're thinking of h as a function of t. So t is my independent variable, h is my dependent variable, t is my input, and then based on t, we can find a unique value of h. Okay, so I want to draw a graph, and I'm going to use the slope and the intercept. Here's how I'm going to use them. The table I'm about to write, you are welcome to write down this table. Many people are fine with just thinking this. Looking first at the intercept, we know that when t is 0, and I'm purposely putting this not in the first row but in the second row, when t is 0, h is 7. Right? That's the intercept. That's what that means, the value of h when t is 0. And now we're going to look at the slope, which is -2/3, which when I have a negative fraction, I can either have a negative numerator or a negative denominator, but not both. For the moment, I'm going to think of negative numerator, positive denominator. And from the slope formula we saw, we know that that's the change in h over the change in t. So that means I can think I have a change in h of -2 and a change of t of +3. So that means I'm going to have a point 3, right? 0 plus 3 is 3. 7 minus 2 is 5. That'll also be a point on my graph. And there's also a point that comes before that. I want to know what plus 3 is 0. Well, the opposite of that is subtracting 3. 0 minus 3 is -3, right? And then negative plus 3 is 0. So to find what plus 3 is 0, I subtract 3 to wind back by 1. Same thing with h, right? I want to know what minus 2 gives me 7. To wind that backwards, I'm going to add 2. 9. When t is -3, h is 9. Okay, so when I draw my graph, I want my t's to go to the left to -3, maybe, depending on my situation. It might be that in my model negative numbers don't make sense, but there's nothing here that tells me that negative numbers don't make sense, so I'm going to go ahead and use them. I want my t to go to the left to -3. And then as I go to the right, my h is decreasing. I'd kind of like it to get to the point where my h crosses my horizontal axis, right? I'd like my line to go all the way down to the axis. So I'm going to extend my t quite a bit to the right. But my h's are all big numbers, so I'm really going to have my h-axis only go up to 9. So I'm going to draw my h-axis first. That's going to be a vertical line. H is playing the role of my y. I want it to go up to 9. And then the axis I happened to draw, well, it goes down to -3. That seems good. And I'll label that as my h-axis. Now my t values, right, I want them to go to the left to -3. Kind of squarish graphs look nice, so maybe I'll draw my t-axis going to the right to +9. And I'll label that axis t. Now, please keep in mind, the part that I just did is really important, right? If you don't have labels on your axes, both variable names and numbers, you have not drawn a graph, you've just drawn a picture. If your horizontal axis and vertical axis are not labeled with variables, they aren't connected to your equation. If they're not labeled with numbers, the points that you draw don't have any meaning. So please make sure that your graphs are labeled. What are we going to actually draw on this graph? Well, we'll start with the intercept. That's going to be the point on our vertical axis. And now we have a choice. We can either use the point in our table, 3, 5, or we can use our slope, which says we go right 3, down 1. Either way, that gives us 2 points on our line. Now, 2 points is enough to draw a line if we're using a ruler. If we have a ruler, we can now just use the ruler and draw that straight line, just like this. There's only one straight line that goes through those 2 points, so we can just draw it if we're using a ruler. If we're not using a ruler, we might want to draw some extra points, and we can do that by counting out the slope again. This was -2, actually not -1. So right 3 down 2, here's another point. Right 3 down 2, here's another point. Backwards is left 3 up 2, here's another point. So if we're not using a ruler, we can fill in those extra points to help guide the line that we're actually drawing. Under a few circumstances, we're going to want to draw a line very carefully with a ruler, but most of the time, if we want a very carefully drawn line, we're going to get a computer to do it, which is what we're going to see in the last video in this lecture.